Turning point. RK equals. Part 1. Conference Room, Republic Cruiser Requiem, Task Force Retribution Flagship, High Orbit over Ryloth. We'll have Galactic Mercy arriving in system within the next 72 hours, sir. Informed us Piet.
Thank you, Ensign. I answered. The command staff of the fleet and ground forces were gathered for another conference. This time we had more information to work with. The first recon flight over Ryloth were completed and we had some data from the people we saved when we took the freighters. It wasn't good.
This is madness, exclaimed Anakin after examining few images of processing camps set up by the Sis. The population of whole regions was being gathered in such places, which were a high-tech version of something a Nazi would have approved. Then they sorted the people in two groups. Prospective slaves who were either collared or implanted with slave chip which did have an explosive charge built in, and the rest, who were left to rot in awful conditions. What made those places death traps was the fact that after the invasion, the logistics network on Ryloth had broken. As a result, there was no longer food, and in places not even sufficient water, reaching the camps. Whether that was an oversight which had murderous repercussions on the locals or by design of some madman within the Sis rank, we didn't know. However, in either case, the outcome was the same. There were already hundreds of thousands starving with a lot of people, especially those in camps near the deserts, dying from thirst. The only places more or less functioning are the towns and cities near major industrial or mining centers. While occupied, the people in those settlements are left largely alone as long as they meet the Sis production quotas. If they fail at it or show any resistance, the locals are sent at one of the camps to be turned into slaves. Finished Piet. While there are few resistance movements, their success is less than one can usually expect on a world as Ryloth,
added Commander Cody.
It's hard to be a guerrillas, when there is no population in which to disappear, as is the case over most of the planet.
I muttered.
Most concerning is what we were told by the people we liberated, said Ahsoka, pointing at one particular stack of pads, amongst the many covering the table.
The proton cannons, grumbled Rex.
That's correct, Captain, I said. We have to deal with at least 3 artillery sites with overlapping range, or land on the other side of the planet from our most important target. Wat Tambor, Anakin spat the name of the September leader who was responsible for the mess below us. If we can capture him, Ryloth is as good as free. He will have deactivation codes for the droid armies on the planet, said Kenobi. I stared at the holomap of Ryloth which was projected over the table. The easy way is out, I grumbled. The cannons in question were placed in the middle of settlements, with the local population used as live shields. So taking them out with orbital strikes wasn't on the table. At least for now. We need to insert small number of ground forces, who are to take out at least 3 of those sites. Then our acclimators can land safely, said Skywalker. Those 3. I pointed at a specific point of the world map. They will give us an access to a few mountain passes leading to the capital and will provide cover from enemy proton cannons on the other side of the mountain range. The city itself is on the edge of the desert. I studied the terrain for a moment. On 3 sides it has nice, clear open terrain for hundreds of kilometers around. If Tambor calls for reinforcements, we will be able to take them out easily, before they are in range to cause any trouble. If they use people as shields, our cruiser's turbolasers can turn the desert into a lava field, cutting off the capital from ground-bound help. And once we have Tambor, Anakin trailed off. I could sense the barely restrained anger raging within his heart. What we found on those freighters hit him hard. Considering our glaring lack of commando units, the 3 strike teams will be led by me and the Jedi. Admiral Yularen, I nodded respectfully at the man. Will take command of the fleet. On a brighter note, I spoke with General Valentra. We should receive few more cruisers and escorts before the day is over. Hopefully those ships as well as our fleet will be able to discourage the Sis from contesting the orbitals. It was time to get close and personal with the separatists. Unfortunately my newest apprentice would be unable to join us for at least today. She had exhausted herself while we were clearing up the freighters. A significant part of her force powers were used in sustaining her, because of the genetic damage I was unable to fix. The good news was that I had contacted few scientists on Coruscant who were already looking into the problem. Unfortunately they were at least months from a viable cure. RK equals. Large gunship, En route to Alpha Site, Ryloth. We plunged through the atmosphere behind 3 assault ships. Each of the acclimators was targeting a separate settlement, using its heavy shields and armor as a barricade between the proton cannons and the gunships, deploying 3 companies of clone troopers. Those were Torrent from Skywalker's 501st, Ghost from 212th Attack Battalion under Commander Cody, and Crate Company under Captain Cat, from my own 11th Legion. Below us could be seen the dying glare of proton explosions. The acclimators blew up a heavy torpedo each, in the upper atmosphere, blinding sensors on the ground for a short period of time. It bought us only a couple of minutes, but that was better than nothing. At any rate, the assault ships did their jobs and retreated with medium damage from the enemy bombardment. The LARTs carrying us flew at the ground at insane velocity, fighting to pass under the proton cannons' engagement envelopes as soon as possible. Our passage through the Ryloth airspace was hazardous, with cannon shells configured as makeshift flak exploding nearby and rocking the gunships. One of the LARTs was crippled from a near miss by warhead meant to contest an assault ship's defenses. Its left side was cut to pieces, and it fell to the ground as a brick, trailing smoke and bodies behind. A shell blew up behind another, totaling its engines, and the stricken transport continued flying at the ground at top speed. It struck nose first, compressing the craft into a metal pancake, for a brief instant, before its onboard weapons and fuel detonated thanks to the impact. The rest of us made it in one piece, and I was thankful for insisting that each bird carried only a single squad each. When the gunships touched down, we disembarked hastily and hurried to assemble within the forest surrounding the small clearing where we landed. On my way to the tree cover, I idly noticed a huge dead insect, which was half devoured. 2 brownish, armored beings were running away, spooked from the LARTs. I hate insects. Especially the damn big ones. It was a side effect from my time fighting those damn things on Alderaan during the war. I glared at the retreating forms and continued running to the trees. We had to hurry. It was a race between a bunch of enemy reinforcements trying to reach the village we were about to strike, if they didn't get wrecked by orbital strikes, and us taking down the cannons. My sight lingered over the equipment carried by my men. Most of them were lugging heavy blasters, man-portable cannons and repeaters, as well as missile launchers. The Jedi in contrast had their troopers carrying only blasters and iron grenades. Something about not wrecking the settlements of the locals. I had nothing of that when my men were concerned. The damn buildings were much cheaper than the life of my soldiers. Outskirts of a Ryloth village, codenamed Site Alpha. In the shadow-covered grounds under the 3 tops of the forest surrounding us, the darker armor made us almost invisible. In the stock white colors, my men would have been sticking out as a whore on a Jedi convention. The village itself was surrounded by a meters-tall wall, which was in bad repair. It was probably built to keep the local wildlife away from the inhabitants. It presented a bit of a problem. There were towers built in it, spaced every 10 meters or so from each other. Each of those was manned by a squad of B-1 droids, which by itself would have been easily to handle. They had heavy repeating blasters, reed machine guns. Add the fact that there was a mercifully short clearing before the edge of the forest and the wall itself, and taking that enemy position with only infantry would have been costly, especially if we had a restricted rules of engagement like the Jedi. I want a missile put into each of the closest towers. I ordered quietly. Preferably before the clankers figure out that we've arrived. I added. Yes, sir, whispered Cat, before he relayed my orders. Naturally, the droids noticed us before we hit them. Either one of the machines was paying closer attention than the others, or one of my men fucked up. Movement. A synthesized voice shouted. Open fire, snapped another. I shook my head. I'll never know why the Sith droids didn't use wireless comms to communicate between themselves. Not that I was going to complain, when their shouts bought my men an extra couple of seconds to get into cover. The repeating blasters opened fire, sending red energy bolts to chew up through the tree line. Suppressive fire on those towers. Now, I snapped while deflecting a stream of crimson death heading towards my position. Every one of the clankers trying to overwhelm my defense was one less that was shooting at my men. We are on it, sir. Couple of my men shouted in unison, their voices barely coming over the cacophony of combat. I glanced at the pair and smirked. They were both carrying blaster carbine, a heavy blaster and a missile launcher. One of them opened up on the closest tower, blasting the droids from the rampart and forcing the rest to duck. Meanwhile his buddy prepared his missile launcher, acquired the target and fired. The warhead surged over the no-man's land between the two sides, and slammed in the repeating blaster. Its heat-charge detonated, obliterating the upper half of the tower in an explosion that didn't look particularly impressive. The pieces of droids and rock raining all over us would beg to differ on that account. In short order the nearby towers were silenced by missile strikes. I nodded approvingly to my men. "Hell yeah," exclaimed the clone who blew up the first tower. "Great work. Pass my regards to the men." I spoke to Cat. I could feel him grinning proudly under his helmet. It was a sweet, short talk. I could sense that we lost only a single man with 4 wounded. "By the way, where did you get these characters?" I asked Cat and nodded at the pair which was strutting around with 3 weapons each. "Ask those," muttered the captain. "I sense a story there," I said while he was preparing to scale the wall. That was an easy exercise thanks to the grappling hooks attached to the weapons carried by my men. A force-assisted lunge later I was on the wall and examining the village. It was ominously quiet. The only sounds were coming from the squads dispatched to deal with the remaining enemies on the wall, so those droids couldn't hit us from the back. I mentally cursed not remembering the events of most seasons of the show. I knew that there was going to be trouble in here, but not what exactly. Cat scaled up the wall seconds after me and joined me in examining the settlement. "Those 2 are Waxer and Boyle. They requested a transfer from 212th Attack Battalion." "That's Kenobi's unit. Why?" "Apparently there is persistent rumor that under your command the rules of engagement are more liberal. I had a chat with Commander Cody about them. He is not pleased that we got a couple of his best men." The captain shrugged and nodded at the pair who had just came up the wall. "Yeah, most Jedi would disapprove from their affair with heavy firepower." I grinned. Those were my kind of soldiers. Now, let's see if they are only good at blowing up shit or if they had other talents too. "I'm taking couple of squads and will be scouting up ahead. I don't like the look of this." I waved at the deadly quiet village. "Let the men take a brief breather and tend to the wounded, while we check for surprises." "Consider it done, sir." When we were behind the wall, I called the pair who had taken my interest. "You 2, troopers. Front and center." Boyle and Waxer, reporting, sir. They ran next to me and straightened up, at attention. "We are going to scout the village. Who know what nasty surprises the clankers have left for us?" I looked straight at them. "I was led to believe that you 2 are some of the best 212th had. It's time to put it to the test." Us, sir?" asked the one to the right. "That's right." I smirked. "And you know what the reward is for a job well done in the army?" They groaned. Yup, they knew. Hey equals. Sys positions, Site Alpha, Ryloth. "We lost contact with the outer perimeter," reported a B-1 droid. "I told you that those tin cans wouldn't be able to even slow the Republic," muttered a bounty hunter. The tactical droid in charge of the Sys contingent tilted its head to the right. "It was expected. I want to know their plans. Send probe droids. I want 855th Platoon and the remaining tanks to reinforce the choke point." "Roger, Roger." The B-1 snapped at attention. "Release your pets," added the merc. "Indeed. The modification you suggested could prove useful," chimed in the tactical droid. The masked woman nodded nonchalantly. Mentally she cursed being stuck at this position. Her commander wanted eyes on the inside of the Sys operations after those madmen attacked Coruscant with the Blue Shadow. It was the prudent thing to do, however it led her in a nasty position. Now she was at least partly responsible for the atrocities committed by the damn separatists. She nervously rechecked her gear. Her rocket backpack was fully fueled and operational. The same was true for her wrist-mounted rocket launcher and flamethrower as all her other toys. She had a bad feeling about what was going to happen. Turning point. =RK equals. Part 2. Alpha Site, Ryloth. So far, the scouting exercise went without a hitch. That in itself was troubling. We met no resistance at all. No booby traps either. The village appeared empty, which was making me nervous. A company or 2 of droids should have been able to bleed and slow down any attacker unwilling to level the settlement. The only other good place to make a stand would be the choke point between 2 cliffs, leading to the small plaza where the cannons were located. It provided nice, long and clear fields of fire, but that worked as a double-edged sword. Any attacker who secured the village would have some cover, not to mention that a spread of missiles would be all it would take to disable the few CSI tanks seen by the recon flights. Well, if I was an arrogant idiot, I might have presumed that the droid in charge of this little slice of Ryloth were lacking in programming and thought that deploying all its forces at the small pass was a good idea. However, with me instead being a paranoid bastard, me and my troopers were searching for the surprises prepared by the separatists for any uninvited visitors such as us. Boyle and Waxer were stalking down the street in front of me, their heads snapping in all direction, scanning for possible threats. At least those two were turning out to be competent scouts, with more talents than just their commendable reliance on overwhelming firepower. As the folks at A Forum Dimensions Away would say, there were very few problems that couldn't be resolved by deployment of sufficient DACA. Not that there was such a thing in existence, of course. I sensed a tiny presence in the force couple of seconds before we heard something shifting a bit of rubble. The sound came from a small alley to our left. There was someone alive here, beside us. My soldiers turned their weapons in the direction of the sound and moved out, taking positions to the sides of the alley. I frowned. I felt anxiety and fear coming in waves from the unknown person. I nodded at Waxer, who had his head turned in my direction. I didn't expect a threat, but better safe than sorry. We weren't playing a game on a training field after all. My men darted into the alley, with their weapons at the ready. I followed suit, thinking that such actions would be made much safer by the addition of short-ranged drones. Just another thing to add to the list. At this rate the R&D boys and girls would be busy for years after the end of the war. "A little girl," exclaimed Boyle. I walked behind the clones who were looking at a child who couldn't be older than 5. She was a cute little thing with light green skin. She was examining us with huge brown eyes. Fear and curiosity were fighting within her tiny hair which was fluttering within her chest. I wondered how those two men, who still had their mental conditioning made by the Kaminoans, would react to the kid. "What are we going to do with her?" Waxer wondered aloud. "We shouldn't do a thing. We have a mission to complete," stated Boyle. "We can't leave her. We should take her with us," exclaimed Waxer. "Are you kidding? She'll slow us down." "Right, sir?" "Perhaps," I muttered. "What do you two think we should do?" I asked innocently. "Look at her. She's terrified of us," pointed out Boyle. "Not from us. Take cover," I snapped quietly and pressed my back in a shadowed corner. The chameleon paint on my armor made me melt into the darkness. The clones followed my example, hiding behind nearby columns, while I projected a small force field which I hoped would made us appear non-existent to life signs detector. It would work only on crappy sensors, but it was the best I could do short of disabling the droid. Moments later a scout droid, similar to the ones made famous by The Empire Strikes Back, perhaps an earlier model, skimmed over the streets where we were before we heard the girl. The machine made a cursory scan before continuing its path. Either it had cheap sensors or it noted our presence and was faking disinterest. We needed to get away from here quickly. Boyle agreed with my reasoning and said so. "We can't leave her here. Not with the clankers searching for us." Waxer disagreed. I could clearly sense Boyle's confusion. He stared at the kid for a few seconds before reaching a decision. "Fine," he snapped at his friend. "I'll carry her." Before any of us could say a thing, he went to grab her, and to Waxer's and my amusement, she growled at my subordinate and clamped her teeth at his index finger. "Ouch! She bit me." I went behind Boyle and slapped the back of his helmet. "Ow? What was that about, sir?" he grumbled. "You are scaring her," exclaimed Waxer. "The child either thinks we are droids or she just don't like you." I smacked at Boyle, who shook his head in exasperation. "I wonder why," muttered Waxer. He removed his helmet and grinned at the kid. "Hey little one. See, we are made of flesh just like you." I could almost see Boyle rolling his eyes at his buddy's antics, before his shoulders slumped. "I think she's starving. Here, take this." He retrieved a piece of a field ration and handed it to his friend. Waxer presented it to the girl, who looked him warily, before carefully sniffing the food. She glanced at each of us in turn before grabbing the meal and taking a small bite off it. She smiled and started eating the food. Boyle removed his helmet too and massaged the back of his head, where I slapped him. Definitely starving. No way she would eat a piece of MRE otherwise. I muttered. Those things kept you alive and that was their only redeeming quality. The less said about the taste the better. Nera. Nera. The girl cheerfully pointed at the clones, then she looked warily at my masked face. No, sweetie. I am Waxer and he is Boyle. He tried to correct her. I chuckled at her antics. Congratulations. I cheered my men. You were just adopted as big brothers. Joy. Grumbled Boyle. I knelt next to the kid and removed my helmet. Hi. I bet you know all the fun hidden places around here, I said. She had to, in order to evade the droids since the invasion began. Can you show us how to sneak to the plaza where the droids are gathered? I asked in Twi'leki. She eagerly nodded, with her head tails swinging wildly. Wouldn't you know, the short stuff's useful for something, muttered Boyle. Waxer, please. I nodded at my other subordinate. He smirked and slapped his friend at the back of his head. Ouch. What is this? Pick on Boyle Day? He exclaimed, while the girl giggled at our antics. I listened to a rapid string of explanations from the kid. Yes. Of course. I grumbled. Why it always has to be sewers? You sure that there is not another hidden way? I asked with forlorn hope. She shook her head and continued nibbling at her meal. Splendid. I muttered dryly. Get your helmets back on. We have a mission to finish. I pointed at the kid. By the way, your new sister's name is Numa. =RK equals. Site Alpha, cis positions. Bo-Katan was toying with a vibroblade, while waiting for the damn tactical droid to reach a decision. The onerous machine was examining the data feed from its scouts, when it straightened up and turned towards an idle B-1 which was simply staying nearby. We located them. The attack can begin now. Release the beasts. It ordered in a voice lacking any emotion. The Mandalorian woman rolled her eyes. Unless the clones were incompetent, she doubted that the animals would be something more than a slight irritation. After all, if the rumors were true, they were made in the image of one of her own kind, and trained by Mandalorian mercenaries to boot. Yet they were content to be slaves to the Republic, and that was something that made her blood boil. No true Mandalorian would let herself stay in such a position. Bo-Katan could hear distant growling from behind her. She shrugged. The beasts should at least slow down the Republic soldiers. She looked over the locals who were used as live shields, and were probably the only reason the village wasn't turned into glowing crater from orbit. Evaluating what foolishness would be done by the cis next was one thing. Being caught as what amounted to a hostage taker by what she expected to be vengeful Republic troops was another. Truly, the only reason she was still on this damn planet was her expectation that the cis fleet in orbit would crush the Republic's Navy attempt to break the blockade. Instead, the Separatist fleet was so much dust across the stars, and she was trapped on the planet. Her FT-capable fighter was securely locked back in the capital, and she was unable to refuse the suggestion to examine and improve the defenses of the artillery positions. Not when Tambor had a platoon of super battle droids nearby, and her ride was under lockdown. Besides, after the mauling they received, the Republic ships in orbit were likely to shoot first and not ask questions if anyone tried to leave the planet. Chris knew that after Coruscant, the GAR would somehow change the way it operated. Witnessing it would be useful to the Death Watch. However, she had the feeling that doing so from the cis side would prove hazardous for one's health. Her frown deepened. Perhaps it was time to cut out her losses and seek a better arrangement. After all, she was not a common mercenary. She owed no allegiance to Tambor and the cis. She moved away from the crate she was leaning on. I'm going to see for myself how good the Republic clones are, she said to the tactical droid and stalked away with a predatory grace. =RK equals. Crate company positions, Alpha Site, Ryloth. I was thankful to the Force and all the gods I could think of for my sealed armor. Slogging through the filth in the sewers to reach the position where Kat and the rest of my men were waiting wasn't fun. If the criffing droids had sensors to pick up smell, they would have found us sniffing around the plaza, when Numa led us to recon the place. Well, it could be worse, I guess. That way we avoided any roaming scout droids, while en route back to our lines. Thanks to the Force and few helpful pointers from Numa we soon reached our destination. I started climbing the ladder leading up to the manhole closest to my men and shouted, "Hold your fire. Incoming friendlies."
I could sense my soldiers' attention snapping our way. I shoved away the manhole cover and got out, to be greeted by half a dozen blasters pointed my way. "Stand down, men. Good to have you back, sir. How did the scouting go?" asked Kat. "Much better than anticipated. We have a covert way in. However, there are a lot of clankers and civilians out there. We'll need a diversion before hitting the place." Behind me a muttering Boyle came out of the manhole, followed by Numa and Waxer. Kat glanced at the kid. "You picked up a stray, sir," he pointed out the obvious. "It's not like we could just leave her behind. Besides, she is damn useful." I trailed off. Something bad was coming our way. I could sense anger and hunger. "Take defensive positions. We have company," I snapped and grabbed my lightsaber and activated it. My men darted in all directions, in a carefully orchestrated chaos. They ran towards hastily prepared positions, preparing to face whatever was coming our way. Behind me Waxer grabbed a startled Numa who shrieked in fright, and sprinted towards a nearby building. I could hear the sound of clawed feet scrapping over the rocky ground. My first thought was that the animals we startled when alerts landed had come back with a vengeance, and brought back friends. That idea was reinforced when a bunch of overgrown bugs covered with brown armored plates appeared behind a nearby corner. They growled at us and sprinted our way without slowing down. "Open fire. Don't let them get near you," I shouted. I could see the blinking lights of demo charges, which were fitted on the beasts. Using animals as kamikaze. Someone on the other side was becoming creative. I needed to find that one. Such creativity needed a fitting reward. My men opened fire on the horde rushing us with everything they got. To my unpleasant surprise, all but few of the heavy blaster bolts were harmlessly absorbed or deflected from the animal's armor. I made a note to take samples for the R&D folks. That stuff appeared to be doing much better job than the armor worn by my men. 2 missiles passed around me and struck a pair of the insect-like creatures, shattering their carapace and dazzling the nearby monstrosities. I gathered as much force as I could in the seconds I had before the beasts reached me, molded it and unleashed the energy at the pack of predators. RK equals. A building overlooking Crate Company position, Alpha Site, Ryloth. Chris watched as animals rushed at the clone's position. She stated at the man in color-shifting armor, who appeared to be in command. That was a useful feature to have, mused a part of her brain. Her attention was on the officer in charge. He looked familiar. Bo-Katan was sure that she has seen him before, probably on the holonet. When he ignited a lightsaber in the color of freshly split blood, it all clicked into place. That was General Vale, the new Gar prodigy. The man credited with engineering both Grievous and Dooku's capture. If the rumors which reached the Death Watch were true, he was a very dangerous man, who apparently was allowed to do whatever he deemed necessary to achieve his mission's objectives. Something that a Mandalorian warrior could respect. What was even more interesting was the rumor that he tortured at least one man and faced no repercussions from his Republic overlords. That in itself was troubling. If the Republic was discarding its foolish ideals and the kiddie gloves with which they appeared to operate for centuries, it would mean that her and her brothers-in-arms cause could be threatened. Or perhaps, this man and what he represented was an opportunity for the true Mandalorians. She watched him snapping orders and the soldiers obeyed without a moment's hesitation. Bo-Katan nodded in approval when they fell in a bunch of prepared positions and opened fire at the beasts attacking them. They were better than she was expecting. The general just stood there, in the middle of the street and appeared to wait. Then he slammed his hands at the ground and the predators, the closest of which were few meters from him, were thrown in the air by invisible force. They floated for a moment, before he made a pushing motion and the beasties were thrown towards the far end of the street, where they hit the facade of a building. Hard. Even from a couple of 100 meters away, she could clearly hear the sound of cracking carapace. Bo-Katan's smile became a grin. So he was really a Force user. Not a Jedi either. They didn't use crimson lightsabers. This day was becoming even more interesting. Chris pressed a button on her wrist-mounted computer and the explosives fitted to the animals detonated, turning the far end of that street into a charnel house. She jumped from the building and slowed her fall with the aid of her rocket pack. Bo-Katan landed 20-odd meters from the general and was about to greet him when she was yanked forward by an invisible force. The man pointed at the animals she just turned into shreds. "I'll make an educated guess. That was originally your idea," he stated in an ominous tone.
Yeah.
Interesting day indeed.
Turning point. =RK equals. Part 3. Crate Company Positions, Alpha Site, Ryloth. I glared at the woman. This stunt with the overgrown bugs turned into living bombs was too creative for the run-of-the-mill cis imbeciles, while being exactly what a Mandalorian would do. For fun, amongst other things. I wondered if her armor was just for show or if she was the real thing. The female I was keeping suspended in midair shrugged. It seemed a good idea at the time.
Indeed. I muttered.
If those things had reached our lines and detonated, my men would have suffered severe casualties. Anything less than missile strikes was pretty useless at taking down the animals.
What is your game,
I wonder? I thought aloud while studying her armored form.
I liked what I saw.
Heavy armor, enough weaponry to make Boyle and Waxer drool. She could fit right in with the Empire's Mandalorian auxiliaries from my past. Not to mention she had curves in all the right places. I shook my head in an attempt to get my mind out of the gutter. It was too damn long since the last time I had gotten laid. I didn't have time to act like a hormonal teen.
Like what you see? She asked.
Oh, my. Definitely, shouted one of my soldiers.
Waxer.
If you will, I snapped. Metal striking metal sounded from behind me.
Ow! What did I do this time?
Grumbled Boyle. Numa, who was near those two clowns, giggled at them. Thank you, Waxer. I quipped. I swear I could hear Cat muttering something about idiots and the nastiest assignments he could find for them. A bit of telekinetic manipulation and a soft clicking could be heard as the seals holding her helmet popped open. I waved my fingers, and it lifted, revealing a beautiful face framed by a crop of shoulder-length fiery red hair. I blinked at her. I knew her. Ironically, I remembered more bits from the later seasons of the Clone Wars than the first few, and all things considered, that was information that was already mostly useless. With the changes that occurred, it was highly unlikely that most things that I could recall would happen in a similar way, if at all. The first time I had any recollection of this woman was while reading re-intel briefings. Granted, those things were largely a work of fiction with only hints of reality mixed in, but they had her name and possible allegiance. Bo-Katan Kryze. Fancy meeting you here. I smiled under my helmet. How's your sister nowadays? I quipped. For few seconds her face was a mask of utter shock before she schooled it back in a cold mask. We need to have a chat, I declared. But I am curious. You are supposed to be one of the best amongst the Death Watch. So, let's put that to the test. I want to see if this age's Mandalorians are anything like the ones I had the honor to fight side by side with during the Great War. Captain Cat, give us some space and don't interfere. I ordered. I released the Bo-Katan, floated her helmet so it was in front of her and smiled cheerfully at her. A challenge, eh? She gave me a lopsided grin, before snatching her helmet and putting it on. I accept, she declared and drew her blaster pistols. =RK equals. Ghost Company, Gamma Site, Ryloth. They are flanking us, shouted a clone. His voice came over the roar of battle and was barely heard by his comrades. Of course they are, grumbled Cody. He blew off the head of an irritating B-1 droid, before snapping out orders, send in what's left of the reserve to the right flank. This could have gone better, muttered Kenobi. The Jedi was anchoring the center of the clone lines, which were under a heavy assault by at least 2 companies of super battle droids and a horde of B-1s. He and his men had managed to break through the outer perimeter of the village and take the first 2 rows of buildings, before the Sith forces counterattacked. The battle had been raging ever since. Obi-Wan felt his men falling one after another. By now, over a third of the clones were down, and the droids showed no sign of relenting in their attacks. Ghost Company simply didn't have the firepower necessary to stop the onslaught. From the corner of his eye, Kenobi saw a trooper have his chest perforated by a long burst of blaster fire. The man slumped back, never to move again. Obi-Wan glared at the machines. They had to reach the cannons and disable them. Every minute they delayed meant more people were dying all over the planet. =RK equals. Torrent Company, Beta Site, Ryloth. Master. Is this your whole plan? Shouted Ahsoka. She was back to back with Anakin, in the center of a large intersection. Nearly 100 droids were advancing towards them from 4 sides, constantly shooting at the 2 Jedi. Pretty much.
he answered with a confident grin on his lips. Just about now. Wait for it. He trailed off. Even more droids were joining the onslaught, straining the Jedi's ability to deflect blaster bolts. Wait for what? There are more clankers coming. Anakin frowned. He used telekinesis to activate his wrist-mounted comm. Rex. Where are you? We can't hold them for much longer. Couple of seconds later, the captain's voice came back. We are a bit busy here, sir, screamed Rex, so he could be heard. 200 meters away, most of Torrent Company was pinned down by 2 platoons of super battle droids, which came to reinforce their metal brethren. Those B-1s are trying to flank us, sir, someone shouted. Send Echo Squad to stall them, snapped Rex. General, we won't be able to make it in time. A platoon of SBs just got between us, sir. We don't have the firepower to dislodge them anytime soon. They are taking defensive positions and trying to contain us. Anakin cringed. Snips, we've got a problem. You think? She deadpanned. Ahsoka could see a couple of droidekas rolling towards them. =RK equals. Part 4. Crate Company Position, Alpha Site, Ryloth. I sealed my helmet and brought my lightsaber back to life. I did it just in time to deflect a burst of fire from the red-haired woman. Her blasters were snapping shots at me as fast as she could pull the trigger. She apparently had trained to fight against Force adepts, because her blaster fire was targeted at my blade, near the hilt. That increased the chance of my saber being blasted out of my hands from the force of the shots, and made it much harder to reflect her weapon's fire back at her. Or that was the theory, anyway. I used the force to strengthen my grip and my smile grew. Bo-Katan could prove to be a challenge. She jumped in the air on jets of flames coming from her rocket pack. She made a motion with her left hand I was closely familiar with and a rocket flew my way. I smacked and slapped the weapon away with a telekinetic wave, then I returned the favor. I sent 2 stun darts from the launcher built in my left arm guard. At the same time, my blade continued to deflect the blaster fire from the airborne Mandalorian. The rocket struck the ground to my right and detonated, showering me with pieces of rock and soil. Bo-Katan twisted gracefully in the air and my dual shots missed her, spending their electric charges at the wall behind her. She shot 2 thin discs from a device on her right hand at me. I met that attack with a force push, which threw the metal slips back at her accompanied by an invisible sphere of energy. Chris flew up, ascending over the reflected attack, which smashed through the wall behind her. She rotated in midair, so the missiles mounted on her back were pointing my way. Her heavier weapon roared my way. Perhaps she thought that I would have a problem thanks to its greater weight and speed. It was time to dissuade her from such notions. I pushed at the missile with both hands and the guided weapon stopped 2 meters from me. Then I used telekinesis to turn it so it pointed at the woman and released it, before rolling away to avoid a hail of blaster shots. She plunged down, trying to evade her own missile, but I used the force to guide it after her. Bo-Katan didn't let that slow her down. She turned around, so she flew backwards, and shot 2 yellow energy bolts, from her left arm guard. One missed, but the second struck the missile pursuing her and detonated its warhead. The explosion sent shrapnel in all directions. It also threw the Mandalorian woman skidding across the ground. She landed hard, and stopped only when she struck the wall of a nearby building. I used her temporary distraction to pluck out of her hand the blaster she managed to keep during her crash landing. It didn't slow her for even a moment. Chris sent 2 of the yellow energy bolts my way and while I deflected them, she launched a metal cord which darted towards my hands, followed by a single metal disc. I used the force to send away the projectile but the rope snagged around my sword arm. Bo-Katan wasted no time and she flew up, dragging me with her. If it wasn't for the force enhancing my body, her move would have dislocated my right shoulder. If I was lucky. I cursed as I headed towards an inconveniently placed building. I twisted my body so I hit the wall feet first and leapt from its surface in a force-assisted jump. My still-ignited lightsaber connected with the metal line, cutting through it and I switched it off before smashing in the woman and grappling her. The time appeared to slow down for me. Our mid-air collision threw away her attempts to control her flight with my additional weight. We spun through the air in uncontrolled fall. She smashed her armored head in my face, which combined with our tumbling through the air was mildly disorienting.
However, thanks to the force, I was well aware where exactly we were and of our distance from the buildings and the ground. I returned the favor, rattling her head within her helmet and twisted us so she'll take the brunt of our fall. I used the force to slow down a bit our headlong plunge to the ground, but it wasn't enough to let either of us get away from that stunt unscratched. We landed hard. I could hear the unpleasant sound of cracking bones. I could feel pain exploding in my left arm and hand, which was under Chris's body when we hit the ground. Son of a bitch. That criffing hurt. RK equals. Ghost Company, Gamma Site, Ryloth. Cody. Iron grenades. I'll guide them so they'll have maximum effect, shouted Obi-Wan. He darted behind a half-demolished wall and nodded to the commander. The Jedi closed his eyes and concentrated. He let his senses fly over the battlefield, noting the positions of his men and the ghostly signatures of the machines. A nearby soldier took out a grenade, primed it and threw the sphere at a group of droids. Kenobi picked up the weapon with the Force, and guided it so it would have maximum effect. It detonated, releasing a pulse of iron energy which fried the electronics of 15 machines. Obi-Wan repeated the process, wiping out robots left and right, until his men ran out of grenades. By then the droids assaulting them were decimated. 5 minutes later, the forces attacking Ghost Company were obliterated, and the path to the cannons and the final defenses around them was clear. Half of Kenobi's men were either dead or wounded by that point. RK equals. Torrent Company, Beta Site, Ryloth. This way, shouted Anakin. Skywalker sent a concentrated beam of telekinetic energy at the wall of a nearby house, blowing a large hole through the stone. He grabbed his apprentice and darted inside, using the Force to move faster than humanly possible. It was almost enough. A shot from a droideka's cannon smashed into his arm, blowing the prosthetics in two. He grunted as shrapnel and few stray blaster bolts struck his armor. It held admirably. Ahsoka was not that lucky. She wasn't wearing an armor. The blaster bolts which managed to hit her during their brief flight to temporary safety, seared wounds across her left thigh and shoulder. She shouted in pain and sagged in Anakin's grip. Skywalker cursed venomously. His lightsaber was still outside, gripped by the fingers of his severed artificial hand. At least it wasn't the good one. He glanced at Snips, who was in no condition to move on her own. At least not fast enough to matter. Anakin could hear the metal feet of the machines clattering over the rock-covered ground outside. They would be all over them in moments. RK equals. Couple of 100 meters. It could as well be miles. Rex threw an iron grenade at a group of super battle droids, which danced under the energy discharge before falling to the ground into a smoking heap. The damn things weren't heedlessly throwing themselves into his men's blaster fire. Instead the droids were taking cover, and were simply content to pin him down. The captain knew why. If the machines managed to take out the general and Ahsoka, he and his soldiers would be easy to dispatch. Cruff it all, the damn things didn't really need to directly kill the clones. If their commander found it practical, the robots could simply keep them under siege and starve them out. It wasn't like he had a bunch of tactical options, as he and his men were armed only with blaster carbines and iron grenades. Besides, the latter were running out. RK equals. Crate Company, Alpha Site, Ryloth. I submerged myself deeply in the light side of the Force. It stung as it passed through me and interacted with the tendrils of darkness still clinging to my being. As usual, I had used the dark side during the battle, and the both sides of the same coin, so to speak, didn't like playing nice with each other. The Force energies were like a cool balm, extinguishing the stabs of pain in my left arm. I felt the cracks in my bones knitting together, until only a light, dull ache remained. Good enough. I turned my attention to Bo-Katan, who lied dazzled on the ground. The crash had made a number on her. Broken and bruised ribs, a bit of internal bleeding, concussion, broken arm. I placed my hands on her chest and let the Force energies use me as a conduit and flow through me and into the wounded woman. The Force could be a wondrous things. Injuries which would take hours spent in a Bacta tank to heal, were mending moments later under my ministrations. RK equals. Bo-Katan grunted in pain as the pieces of a broken rib shifted within her chest. She felt woozy and her eyes weren't working right. She blinked and stared. Over her, a blurred image of two men were kneeling. They had their hands on her chest. She frowned and tried to slug the bastards, but her right arm exploded in pain and refused to obey. Broken. Her mind dutifully supplied the explanation. Chris froze. She could feel her broken rib shifting and then knitting back together. It was not by any means the only strange sensation passing through her body. She could feel liquid draining from her lungs. There was a pinch within her chest, and Bo-Katan somehow knew that an internal injury had just been sealed by a patch of healthy flesh. Soon her right hand followed. The bones under her skin moved like they were alive, but it didn't hurt. No, that wasn't right. There was the pain, but it was distant, as if it was behind a wall of light, which was not only acting as a painkiller, but it made her calm. That thing, whatever it was the reason she felt unusually calm, given the circumstances. Her right hand twitched as the bone was regrowing in the correct way. Around the bone, injured tissue was healing at an astounding rate. At last, Bo-Katan could feel a warm stream passing through her body, washing her headache away. Her eyes focused, and now there was only one man kneeling over her. It was the general she fought with. Her eyes trailed down his arms and she frowned. His left head was laying in the valley between her breasts and his right was over her heart, with its palm cupping part of her left breast. Bo-Katan's right eye twitched and she put her freshly healed right hand to the test. She slugged the armored head of the man standing over her. Hard. He just took it and tilted his head to the left. "If you've got it out of your system, we need to talk," he said calmly, as if she hadn't hit him hard enough to crack someone's jaw.